When life knocks you down with betrayal and heartbreak, you have two choices: stay broken or rise stronger. This story is about transformation, turning pain into purpose and loss into power. It proves that no matter how dark things get, resilience and self-belief will always lead you back to strength, while karma takes care of the rest.
They were actually laughing at her mother's funeral. As she stood there, 8 months pregnant, in a dress she had sewn herself, her husband's family was laughing. Victoria Blackwood's voice was so sharp it could break glass. "I warned Preston this is what happens when you marry down. Her mother could not even manage a proper funeral." Colleen's hands started to shake. Her own husband, Preston, would not even meet her eyes. But the Blackwoods had no idea about the secret. It was a secret no one knew. The poor seamstress they were making fun of had a hidden fortune of $100 billion, and now every single dollar belonged to Colleen. For 6 long years they had treated her like a charity case, the wife who married into their money. For 6 years they chipped away at her confidence until she hardly knew herself. For 6 years they thought they had all the control. But the moment Colleen learned the truth about her mother, her inheritance, and why Preston really married her, the rules of the game were about to change forever. This is more than a story about getting even. It is the story of a woman who found the key to unlock her own prison, and you will be shocked when you see what she did next. The Blackwoods were completely unaware of what was coming. It is often the case that people who see you as small are the ones who are truly empty inside. Your value is never decided by another person's failure to see it. And choosing to leave a painful situation is not a weakness. It is choosing to rescue yourself. This story is a strong reminder that real power is not always loud and forceful. It is the quiet bravery to leave behind anything that makes you feel small and to create a life that feels right. It is the certain knowledge that you are worth more, even when others try to convince you that you are not. And it is the understanding that the best inheritance is not money, but the wisdom to know your own value. They were laughing at her mother's funeral. The entire Blackwood family was laughing. Colleen stood just inside the doorway of the Patterson family funeral home. She rested one hand on her swollen, pregnant belly. Her other hand gripped the doorframe to keep herself steady. At 8 months pregnant, she wore a simple black dress she had made with her own 2 hands. She saw her husband's family gathered together in the back, like vultures waiting for their moment. Victoria Blackwood's voice sliced through the quiet room with painful clarity. "I told Preston this is exactly what occurs when you marry beneath your station. The woman could not even pay for a respectable service." The insult felt like a punch to Colleen's stomach. Her mother's casket sat at the front of the chapel, decorated with humble bouquets of flowers. There were white lilies, bright yellow roses, and carnations in a pretty, soft pink. Her mother had always adored carnations. She used to say they had the scent of a Sunday morning. Colleen's hand tightened over her stomach, and the baby gave a sudden, hard kick against her palm. It was a small rebellion against the stress that was washing over her. She felt the little kicks. 1, then 2, and then 3. It was as if her daughter already sensed that something was terribly wrong. The funeral home smelled sterile, a mix of lemon polish and fake flowers. Quiet classical music drifted from speakers in the ceiling, a style her mother would have disliked. Maggie Hayes had loved old country songs and church music, which she sang loudly and off-key while cooking breakfast. Preston walked over to her, and for a short, foolish moment, Colleen thought he was coming to comfort her. He looked very handsome in his dark gray suit, with his black hair perfectly styled and a firm expression on his face. She used to think that determined expression was a sign of his strength, but after 6 years of marriage, she had learned to see that look in a much different way. "My mother is right," he whispered, his voice so near that she could smell his expensive aftershave. It had a scent of sandalwood and privilege. "This is humiliating, Colleen. Why did you not allow us to pay for a service with some dignity?" Colleen just stared at him, unable to speak. This was the same man who had picked a bundle of wildflowers for her on their 3rd date. The man who had wept at their wedding. The man who had vowed to love her through sickness and health, for richer or for poorer. "This is what Mom wanted," she answered, her voice so quiet it was almost gone. "She wanted something simple." Preston's jaw became tight, and a small muscle jumped in his cheek. "Everything about your family is simple." He turned on his heel and walked away before she could say another word. Not that she would have known what to say. 6 years as his wife had shown her that saying nothing was usually the safest thing to do. The service started promptly at 2 o'clock. Colleen sat all alone in the front row. The old wooden pew groaned under her weight. Behind her, she could hear the Blackwoods shuffling as they took their seats 3 rows back. They were far enough away to show their disapproval, but close enough for her to feel them there. Pastor Williams talked about finding peace in the afterlife. He spoke about the comfort of heaven. He had been her mother's pastor for 30 years. He had watched Colleen grow from a little girl who sat in the 3rd row of the First Baptist Church. His voice cracked for a second when he mentioned Maggie's famous apple pie, the one she brought to every single church event. She made so many people's lives better with her good heart, he said. Her hands were never still. She was always sewing, fixing something, or making something lovely from a plain piece of fabric. From the row behind Colleen, Sloane Blackwood whispered to her mother, "Can you believe she is actually wearing a homemade dress to a funeral?" Victoria's answer was a quiet hiss, almost too soft to hear. Like mother, like daughter. Colleen pressed her fingernails into the palms of her hands. She kept her eyes on the casket, on the arrangement of white lilies resting on top of it, and on the framed picture of her mother. In the photograph, her mother was smiling in her garden, with dirt on her hands and pure happiness in her eyes. When it was her turn to give the eulogy, Colleen stood up on legs that felt like they were made of pudding. The short walk to the podium felt like it was 100 miles long. She held on to the sides of the wooden stand to steady herself and looked at the small group of people. There were 37 people there. They were neighbors, people from her church, some of her mother's customers, and the Blackwoods, who watched her like she was a criminal on trial. "My mother's hands," Colleen started, but her voice was shaky. She took a breath and started again. "My mother's hands were her greatest gift. They were the hands that created my Halloween costumes and my dress for the senior prom. They were the hands that put bandages on my knees when I fell. They were the hands that held my own whenever I was afraid." She stopped, finding it hard to swallow past the heavy lump that was growing in her throat. The baby moved, pushing its small body up into her ribs. "Mama taught me that love is not about big, expensive displays. It is about being there, every single day, with patience, with kindness, and with grace. She was there for every person in this room at one time or another, and she never expected anything back." Behind her, she heard Preston let out a sigh of annoyance. The sound was full of frustration. To Colleen, it was as loud and sharp as a scream. "I do not know how I am going to live in a world without her," Colleen went on, her voice shaking with sadness. "But I know she would want me to be strong. She would want me to remember that being simple does not mean you are unimportant, that being homemade does not mean you are without value, and that true love does not need to perform for anyone." As she said those final words, she looked straight at Victoria Blackwood. The older woman's cold expression did not change one bit. Her face was a perfect, unmoving mask. "I love you, Mama," Colleen whispered. "Thank you for everything." She walked back to her seat on unsteady legs, her heart beating fast in her chest. The service went on with more songs, more prayers, and more nice words from people who had genuinely known and cared for her mother. The whole time the Blackwoods sat in their row, looking at their phones, whispering to each other, and just waiting for it to all be done. After the last prayer was said, the funeral director came over to Colleen with an envelope. He was a man with a kind face in his 60s named Harold Patterson. He had also taken care of her father's funeral 12 years before. "Your mother left very specific instructions," he said in a low voice. "You must read this by yourself after the service is over." Colleen glanced down at the envelope. Her name was written on the front in her mother's lovely, neat handwriting. The paper felt thick and of high quality. "There is also a key," Harold said, "and an address." She was very clear about when you should receive this. Before Colleen had a chance to ask what he meant, Victoria was suddenly beside her. "We have to go to the reception. Our guests are already waiting." The reception was planned at the Blackwood family mansion. The gathering was held there simply because Victoria had decided Colleen's childhood home was not grand enough for her guests, and whatever Victoria wanted, Victoria always got. Colleen tucked the mysterious envelope from her mother into her purse. "I will be there in just a moment," she promised. The drive to the Blackwood estate took exactly 23 minutes. Colleen followed the winding roads of the Connecticut countryside. She passed old stone walls and trees that were beginning to turn beautiful colors for autumn. She also passed houses that cost more than most people would see in their entire lifetime. Her mother's old Honda looked completely out of place among the expensive Mercedes and BMWs that would soon crowd the circular driveway. She automatically pulled her car around to the service entrance, an old habit she had learned years ago. Victoria had once remarked that Colleen's car made the front of the magnificent house look cheap. The estate itself sat on 3 acres of perfectly sculpted grounds. It had gray stone walls and dark black shutters. Massive white columns supported the front porch, which Victoria loved to claim were from the 1780s. Everything about the house was designed to scream money, history, and a deep sense of belonging. But Colleen had never felt like she belonged there. Not for a single second. Even after 6 years, she still felt like a guest who had stayed far too long. Inside, hired servers from a catering company weaved through, rooms that were crowded with people who had never even met her mother. The clinking of crystal glasses and the sound of polite laughter echoed in the air. The scent of fancy appetizers mingled with expensive perfume and the smell of wood polish. Colleen moved through the grand rooms as if she were completely invisible. A few people mumbled their condolences to her, but they never even bothered to look her in the eye. Most of the guests simply ignored her, gathering around the Blackwood family, who were holding court by the enormous fireplace. She eventually escaped to the kitchen, where she found herself alone with the catering staff. A young woman with kind eyes noticed her and handed her a glass of water. "You should probably sit down," the woman said gently. "You look absolutely exhausted." Colleen's hand trembled as she took the glass. "Thank you so much. I'm truly sorry for your loss." In that moment, those simple words felt more real than anything the Blackwoods had said to her all day. Colleen was still standing in the kitchen when Victoria finally came to look for her. "There you are." Victoria's smile was as cold as ice and did not reach her eyes. It never did. "Hiding out in the kitchen, how very fitting for you." "I just needed a minute to myself." "You have had your minutes. Now it is time to do your duty as the lady of this house." Victoria moved closer, so close that Colleen could see the tiny lines underneath her makeup. Her foundation was perfect. I could smell her expensive Chanel No. 5 perfume, and I could also smell the white wine on her breath. "I have been incredibly patient with you for 6 long years, Colleen," Victoria said. Her voice was quiet, but her words felt as sharp as a knife. "Now that your mother is finally gone, we can drop this little charade. You were never good enough for my son." Each word felt like a slap in the face. "You were just a little project for him, a charity case he picked up because he felt sorry for you." I grabbed the granite countertop to keep myself from falling. The stone felt cold under my shaking fingers. "Preston chose me," I managed to choke out. Victoria let out a small laugh. It was a light, musical sound that held absolutely no warmth. "Preston chose a pretty little thing he thought he could mold. And just look at how that worked out." She waved a hand toward my 8-month pregnant belly and my simple, homemade dress. "You are still just a teacher at that little school, still driving that embarrassing car, still thinking that love is all you need." She leaned in, and her voice became a cruel whisper. "Love is never enough, my dear. Money is enough. Status is enough. And you, my dear, have none of those things." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. The perfect reply was trapped somewhere deep inside of me. It was buried under 6 years of staying quiet and forcing myself to smile. Victoria patted my cheek, and her touch felt as cold as her heart. "Do try to socialize, dear. For Preston's sake." Then she turned and glided right out of the kitchen. I was left there all alone, my hands shaking and my heart pounding in my chest. And in that moment, a terrible thought began to form in my mind. I had been a complete and utter fool. For 6 long years, I had put my faith in the goodness of people who had never shown me a single ounce of genuine kindness. Just then, my phone buzzed in my purse. It was a text message from my best friend Ross. The message said, "Where are you? I just got here." These people are a little intense. I found Ross standing near a huge, sweeping staircase. Her bright red dress was a welcome splash of color in a room filled with black and gray suits. Rosalind had been my best friend since we were in college. She was my person. Bathroom, Ross said, taking one look at my tear-streaked face. Right now. We slipped into a small powder room and locked the door behind us. Ross leaned against the fancy marble sink and crossed her arms. Okay, tell me everything, she demanded. And so I did. The entire story of 6 years of quiet unhappiness just came spilling out of me. I told her about the diet books Victoria would wrap up for me every single Christmas. I told her how Preston would correct my grammar in front of all his friends. I told her how his sister was constantly comparing me to his old girlfriend. They were laughing during my mother's funeral, I sobbed. Tears were now streaming down my face. While the pastor was speaking about my mom's gentle spirit, they were whispering and laughing about the flower arrangements. Ross wrapped me in a very tight hug. And then why are you still with him? She asked softly. My hand went to my stomach without me even thinking about it. The baby gave a little kick, and then another one. It was a tiny reminder of the family I was trying so hard to build. I just thought things would get better, I whispered. I thought that when the baby came, they would... Ross finished my sentence for me. They would what? Suddenly grow a conscience? I thought they would love her, I admitted. I thought that would be enough to finally make them love me too. Ross's expression softened with sympathy. Oh, sweetie, that is not stupid. That is hopeful. There is a very big difference. I wiped at my eyes, smearing my makeup everywhere, but I did not care. It felt like nothing really mattered anymore. The only thing that mattered was the sealed envelope that was tucked safely inside my purse. I had a very strong feeling that my entire life was about to be turned completely upside down. I looked at Ross and said, "My mother left something for me. She left a key, an address I have never seen before, and a few instructions." Ross stood up straight, suddenly all business. "So what are you waiting for?" she asked. "I cannot just walk out in the middle of this party," I said. Ross put her hand on my arm. "Your mother just passed away," she reminded me gently. "You can do whatever you want to do right now." Her words hit me, giving me a sense of permission I had not felt in years. I will go tomorrow, I decided. Tonight, I just need to make it through this. I got through the rest of the evening by sticking close to Ross and avoiding the Blackwood family as much as possible. At one point, Preston backed me into a corner and asked why I was ignoring his guests. I did not have the energy to explain that they were his friends, not mine. I did not tell him that I felt like a hired actress in their family play, a character they tolerated, but had never really accepted. That night, I slept alone in the guest room. Preston said my pregnancy made me toss and turn so much that he could not get any sleep. Alone in the quiet room, I finally opened my mother's envelope. A small, old-fashioned silver key fell out. A piece of paper had an address written on it, 37 Pemberton Lane. I'd never even heard of that street. Below the address, my mother's perfect cursive spelled out a single sentence. "Please forgive me for keeping so many secrets. It is time for you to know the truth." I think I read that line 4 or 5 times. I clutched the paper to my chest and cried until I had no tears left to cry. I cried until the first morning light started to peek through the curtains. Just then, the baby kicked. A little reminder that a new day was coming, whether I was ready for it or not. The law office of Pemberton and Associates was in a handsome brick building on a quiet, tree-lined street. I parked my car and just looked at the shiny gold numbers on the front door. 37. I was in the right place. I had not told Preston where I was going. Ross was the only one who knew my plan. She had offered to come with me, but she understood when I explained that I needed to do this by myself. The building smelled comforting, like old books and lemon furniture polish. A kind receptionist with beautiful silver hair showed me to an office that was filled with warm morning sunlight. A man named Walter Pemberton stood up from behind a large wooden desk to greet me. He was a tall man, probably in his 70s, with a kind face and a neatly trimmed gray beard. His suit was obviously expensive, but he wore it comfortably, like a favorite old jacket. Colleen, he said, and his voice was warm. You look exactly like your mother did at your age. He told me they had been friends for 40 years. He pointed to a leather chair. Please, have a seat. This may take some time. I carefully lowered myself into the chair. The baby was kicking up a storm as if it could feel how nervous I was. Walter opened a folder on his desk. I am about to tell you a story that is going to sound completely unbelievable, he started. I just ask that you listen to the whole thing before you say anything, all right? He looked at me with an expression that was both sad and sympathetic. Your mother's real name was Margaret Eleanor Hayes. He explained that she was the only heir to the entire Hayes Technologies fortune. He let that information hang in the air for a moment. He then said, and that, Colleen, makes you the owner of property and assets valued at roughly $100 billion. The entire room seemed to tilt sideways. I grabbed the arms of the chair to keep myself steady. That is just not possible, I whispered. My mother was just a simple seamstress. Walter answered in a soft and incredibly gentle voice. She chose to be a seamstress. He continued. She made the choice to give you a simple life. She wanted you far away from all the problems that come with having so much money. She wanted you to find out who you really were, without a fortune telling you who to be. $100 billion. The number did not even sound real. It was the type of money you only read about in fancy magazines. It belonged to powerful chief executive officers and royal families, not to my mother. My mom was the kind of woman who used coupons and bought her clothes at secondhand stores. She always taught me that true happiness comes from wanting less, not from having more. I just do not understand any of this, I said, and my voice was shaking. Walter gently pushed a photograph across the shiny surface of his desk. It was a picture of a young woman who had my same eyes. She was standing next to an older couple who looked very serious. They were all standing in front of a huge mansion. The young woman in the photo was wearing a graduation gown, and she was smiling, but you could see a little bit of sadness in her eyes. That is your mother when she was 22 years old, Walter explained. This was taken the day she graduated from Princeton University, and those two people are your grandparents, Harold and Eleanor Hayes. They were the ones who started Hayes Technologies. My hand was trembling as I reached out and picked up the photograph. The woman in that picture was without a doubt my mother. She looked much younger and so much more glamorous. But her smile was the same. The proud way she held her head was exactly the same too. Why would she leave all of this behind? I had to ask. Because her parents cared far more about money than they ever cared about love. They tried to make her marry someone she did not love. They demanded that she be absolutely perfect all the time. They treated her more like a part of their business than like their own daughter. A deep and old sadness had crept into Walter's voice. Margaret told them she dreamed of being a kindergarten teacher. They told her that job was beneath her. She told them she wanted to marry someone she loved. They told her that love was a silly luxury that only poor people could afford. My thoughts immediately jumped to Victoria Blackwood and then to Preston. My whole marriage had felt like one very long and tiring job interview. She ran away when she was only 18 years old, Walter went on. She changed her name completely and built a new, simple life for herself. But she never truly walked away from the company. She guided it from a distance, protecting what her family had built while turning her back on their way of life. Walter gave a small, sad smile. She was an incredibly brilliant woman. The board of directors never once suspected that their most trusted advisor was a seamstress who lived in a tiny house in a small town. My baby gave a strong kick inside me. I put a hand on my stomach and tried to calm my breathing. The sewing machine, I whispered out loud. The old car she drove, that tiny little house. All those years she spent counting every single penny. Walter leaned forward a little, and his eyes were full of sincerity. Your mother truly believed that money could be a very destructive thing. She used to say that having a lot of wealth without strong moral values was like drinking poison. She wanted you to build a strong character first, before she handed you an entire kingdom. A kingdom that was worth $100 billion? Colleen thought about all the times she had asked for something new when she was a little girl. She could remember her mother gently saying no. She would guide her to appreciate the things she already had. She could still see her mother's peaceful smile as she would say, We have everything that we need." Colleen remembered feeling a little bit ashamed of their simple life, especially after she married into the Blackwood family. But her mother had not been keeping things from her. She had been protecting her all along. "There is one more thing," Walter said. He handed her a small flash drive. "These are her journals. She kept them on her computer. She wrote to you almost every single day for 30 years. Colleen took the tiny device. It felt like it weighed nothing in her hand, but it held 3 decades of her mother's most secret thoughts and feelings. "She wanted you to have choices," Walter said. "Real choices. The kind of choices that she never had. The kind that money can help you get, but can never really buy for you." He stopped talking, letting his words sink in. "The question you need to ask yourself now, Colleen, is a very simple one. What is it that you want?" She had no idea how to answer that question. For the last 6 years, the only thing she had ever wanted was for Preston to love her. She had desperately wanted the Blackwood family to accept her. She had tried so hard to build a warm family life inside that cold, giant mansion surrounded by people who only ever seemed to look down on her. All of a sudden, those old dreams felt like they belonged to a different person. "I need some time to think," she finally said. "You have all the time in the world. The estate is completely secure, and I am not going anywhere." Walter handed her his business card. "You can call me anytime you need, day or night. I made a promise to your mother that I would always look out for you. I plan on keeping that promise." Colleen drove back to her mother's house feeling like she was in a dream. The familiar streets she grew up on now looked like a foreign country. The modest houses, with their little lawns and simple fences, all seemed different. She drove past the elementary school where she used to teach before her pregnancy made it too hard to be on her feet all day. She saw the grocery store where her mother did her shopping every Tuesday morning without fail. Her mother had walked these very same streets because she chose to. She had carefully and intentionally built this simple life, one single decision at a time. She had picked a simple life when she could have had anything at all in the entire world. The house was exactly how her mother had left it. Colleen used her key to unlock the front door. The moment she stepped inside, she was met with the familiar smell of lavender and lemon. It was her mother's smell. It was the smell of home. She walked slowly from room to room. Everything looked the same, but it all felt completely different now. She saw the old-fashioned sewing machine sitting in the corner. When she walked closer, she saw the brand name on it, Singer. It was a real antique, and it was probably worth thousands of dollars. Then her eyes moved to the paintings on the walls. She had always thought they were just cheap copies, but now she could actually see the texture of the brushstrokes. They were original paintings, signed by artists whose work she had seen in museums. Her mother had hidden her amazing fortune right in plain sight. Colleen slowly sat down on the well-loved sofa. The cushions still felt like they held the shape of her mother's body. The crocheted blanket that was draped over the back still smelled like her favorite fabric softener and chamomile tea. She sat right there for what felt like hours. The afternoon sun moved across the sky and made long shadows through the curtains. The refrigerator made its quiet, familiar humming sound from the kitchen. A car drove by on the street outside. When she finally stood up, it was to walk through the house one more time. She touched every little thing, trying to reconnect with her memories. Her mother's reading glasses were still sitting on the nightstand. Her slippers were placed neatly just under the bed. In the kitchen, the recipe for apple pie was still taped to the inside of the spice cabinet door. Colleen ran her finger over the familiar handwriting. Cinnamon, 2 teaspoons. Nutmeg, 1/2 teaspoon. Love unlimited. Her mother had added that last part as a little joke. Colleen was only 7 years old when her mom first wrote it down. It had never been taken down. She opened the refrigerator. She saw leftovers from meals her mother would now never be able to finish. There was a casserole from Mrs. Patterson, who lived next door. There was a pie from the ladies at her church. These were the simple acts of kindness from ordinary people. They had loved her mother without knowing anything about billions of dollars or secret family fortunes. Colleen sat down on her mother's bed. She hugged her pillow as tight as she could and finally let the sharp pain of missing her mother wash over her. It was not about the money. It was not about any of the secrets. The empty space where her mother should have been was a physical ache. Grief crashed over her in giant waves, making it impossible to catch her breath. In between the waves, there were moments of strange quiet, but then the sadness would rush in again. She sat there as day turned to night, watching the streetlights stretch long shadows through the rooms. For hours, her phone had been buzzing nonstop. It was Preston, Victoria, and Sloane sending message after message. They all demanded to know where she was. They insisted she come back right away. They talked about her duties and social plans, a list of things that seemed so important only yesterday. She ignored them all. Instead, she found an old laptop, plugged in her mother's flash drive, and started to read. The first entry was from 30 years ago, written on the day Colleen was born. My beautiful daughter came into the world at 3:47 this morning. She was 7 pounds and 4 ounces of absolute perfection. I held her in my arms and just cried. I was crying because I finally understood what my own parents never could. Love is not about what someone gives you. It is about the person they help you become. I will spend my life trying to be the mother this little soul deserves. I will protect her from all the things that ever hurt me. I will give her roots to keep her grounded and wings to let her fly. I will give her the freedom to choose her own way. My love for her will come with no conditions and no expectations. This is my promise. This is my purpose. This is my whole world. Colleen's tears blurred the words as she read entry after entry, year after year. She could hear her mother's voice in every sentence. When sleep finally came, she was curled up on her mother's bed, the laptop beside her. Her hand was resting on her own belly, where her own little girl was waiting to be born. The next morning, she found the journal entry she'd been afraid to see. Preston Blackwood proposed to my daughter today. She called me, crying with happiness, but I do not feel happy at all. I had him investigated. His family is drowning in debt. Their fortune is like a house of cards built on their family name and a lot of borrowed money. They do not want my Colleen because they love her. They want her for the inheritance they think she will get. They believe she has nothing. They are wrong, but I hope she never has to find that out. Colleen's hands shook as she continued to read. The wedding was beautiful. Colleen looked like an angel. But I watched the Blackwoods watching her, and I saw cold, hard business where there should have been joy. I wanted to tell her the truth. I wanted to give her the power she deserved. But she looked so hopeful, so sure that love was enough. I just could not break her heart, not then. I told myself there would be more time. You always believe there is more time until there is none left. There was more. 6 years of entries described her daughter's struggles. Her mother wrote about how the Blackwoods slowly chipped away at her confidence. She was just watching, holding back, and praying things would get better. The very last entry was from only 2 weeks before her mother died. I was wrong to keep this from her. I see how they treat her now, the way Victoria looks down on her, the way Preston always corrects her in front of people, the way she seems to get a little smaller every time I see her. I should have told her the truth years ago. I should have trusted her to be strong. I am going to tell her everything. I just need to find the right moment. I pray I still have time. But her time ran out. A stroke took her in her sleep. It was fast and quiet and a complete shock. The doctor told Colleen she did not suffer, but that was a small comfort. In truth, it was no comfort at all. Colleen closed the laptop. Outside, birds were singing in the big maple tree. She could hear the hum of a lawnmower somewhere down the street. They were the simple sounds of an ordinary neighborhood, a neighborhood that had been keeping a very big secret. Her phone buzzed again. It was Preston. Where are you? My mother wants to discuss the baby shower. She has some problems with your suggestions. Colleen stared at the message for a long time. Then she slowly typed back. I am at my mother's. I will be home soon. His reply came instantly. Do not be too long, and you should change before you get here. That dress you wore yesterday was not very flattering. She turned her phone completely off. For the first time in 6 long years, Colleen Hayes Blackwood had a secret of her own. The days after the funeral were a complete fog. Everything felt blurry, like a painting left in the rain. Colleen split her time between her mother's house and the Blackwood mansion. She was living in two separate worlds that were complete opposites. At her mother's house, she read the journals and sorted through her belongings, discovering the real woman behind the quiet seamstress. At the Blackwood estate, she played the part of Preston's wife and Victoria's barely tolerated daughter-in-law. She was preparing for a baby shower that she had no say in planning. The difference between the two places was exhausting. "We have reserved the Meridian Country Club," Victoria announced one morning over breakfast. "The party will be on Saturday, the 15th. I have already sent invitations to all of our important friends." Colleen looked up from her toast, which she had not touched. "I want to invite some of my mother's friends." Victoria's polite smile never faded. And what friends would that be? The woman never went anywhere. She had friends. People from her church, her sewing clients, women who actually knew her. "This is a Blackwood event. We cannot just have anyone there." Preston refilled his coffee, avoiding eye contact with both of them. "My dear, Mother knows best about these things. It is just easier to let her handle it." Colleen's mind went back to her mother's journals, filled with all those years of watching and waiting. She thought about the strength her mother had wanted to give her, but it had arrived too late. "My mother chose to live her life exactly how she wanted," Colleen said. Her voice was quiet but firm. "Unlike some people, she never felt the need to perform for an audience." The words settled over the silent room. Victoria's fork stopped on its way to her mouth. Preston's hand paused on the coffee pot. Even the housekeeper, who was dusting a nearby cabinet, froze. "I beg your pardon?" Victoria finally said. "You heard me." Victoria placed her fork on her plate with slow, deliberate care. "I am going to pretend that your little outburst is because of pregnancy hormones and your grief. But I would advise you to remember your position in this family." Colleen looked straight at her. "And what is my position exactly?" Preston finally turned to her. He looked confused and annoyed, like a machine that had suddenly malfunctioned. "You are my wife. You are the mother of my child. What other position is there?" A million different responses, a million things left unsaid for 6 years, rose up inside her. But instead, Colleen just pushed her chair back. It made a loud scraping sound on the polished floor. "I need some air." She drove straight to her mother's house. She did not have to think about the directions. The route was etched into her memory. She took a left at the old stone church, a right at the elementary school. She drove past the grocery store where her mother shopped every Tuesday. Once inside, she went right to the sewing room. It was her mother's sanctuary. The small room was filled with colorful fabrics, spools of thread in every shade, and projects left unfinished. The old Singer sewing machine sat by the window, a piece of light blue silk still threaded through the needle. Colleen ran her hand over the machine. The metal was cool and smooth, worn down by decades of use. Her mother had spent countless hours in this spot, creating beautiful things from simple cloth. She made dresses, curtains, Halloween costumes, and even prom gowns. Colleen reached into a basket and took out a piece of fabric. It was a soft yellow cotton with a pattern of tiny white flowers. Her mother had been making a gift for her granddaughter. From the size of it, it looked like a baby blanket. Colleen held the fabric up to her face and breathed in. Her mother's scent was still there, woven into every thread. It smelled like lavender, lemon, and the special kind of warmth that comes from hands that have worked, created, and loved for a whole lifetime. The tears started to fall before she could stop them. She cried for the little blanket that would never be finished. She cried for the grandmother her daughter would never get to meet. And she cried for all the secrets that had been lost forever, in a quiet moment in the middle of the night. When she could not cry anymore, she sat down at the sewing machine. She tried to remember the simple lessons her mother had taught her so long ago. She remembered the old, familiar motions. She knew how to thread the needle. She recalled how to guide the fabric with a soft touch. She was making something whole out of pieces, one simple stitch after another. For hours and hours she just sat and sewed. Her stitches were not perfect, and her seams were not completely straight. But little by little, the blanket started to become a real thing. When she finally looked up, the light had changed outside. The afternoon sun had faded into the soft glow of evening. Her back ached, her eyes felt heavy, and a new tightness spread across her belly. The first signs of contractions were beginning, but the blanket was almost finished. She completed the final edge with hand stitches just as her mother had taught her. She used tiny, careful stitches that were designed to disappear into the fabric. It was a true test of her patience and skill. Her mother's voice seemed to fill the quiet room. Anyone can rush a project. The real art is taking your time, do it right, and make something that will last. Colleen held the blanket up. It was far from perfect. The corners did not line up exactly. One side was a little longer than the others. A professional would have cringed. But Colleen knew her daughter would be wrapped in love. She would be wrapped in the last thing her own grandmother ever started. That was worth more than perfection. The next day she met with Walter Pemberton again. This time she came with a list of questions. "I need to know about my grandmother," she began. "Eleanor. Is she still with us?" Walter gave her a slow nod. "She is 89 years old, and from what her nurses tell me, she is as sharp as ever. She still lives at the family estate in Boston." Colleen needed to understand. "Does she know I exist?" "She has known about you from the day you were born. Your mother sent her pictures of you every single year. She mailed cards on Christmas and wrote letters about your life." He stopped for a moment. They never actually spoke on the phone. The pain of what happened was just too great for either of them to handle. But Eleanor never gave up hope that they would find their way back to each other someday. Colleen tried to process this new world. She had a grandmother she never knew. A whole part of her family had been kept a secret. And what about my grandfather? Harold passed away from a heart attack about 15 years ago. Your mother actually attended his funeral, but she went in disguise. She sat in the very back row and left before anyone had a chance to see her. She never told me any of this. She was trying to protect you from a very complicated life, Walter said kindly. That was the greatest thing she could give you, but it was also the heaviest burden she had to carry. Now all of those complications are yours. The company, the money, the family history. Your mother left it all to you because she believed with her entire heart that you were strong enough to handle it. "I do not feel strong at all," Colleen admitted in a quiet voice. She did not feel strong at your age either. Strength is not a feeling you have all the time. It is something you find only when you have no other choice. Colleen thought about his words on the drive back to her mother's house. She thought about strength and secrets. She thought about all the different choices that come together to create a life. Suddenly, the world around her looked completely different. She noticed the modest houses with their neat, well-tended gardens. She saw the elementary school where she had taught the second grade for 3 years. She drove past the church where her mother went to pray every Sunday. She could picture her sitting in the third row, singing the hymns a little bit off-key. Her mother had chosen this simple life. She had turned her back on billions of dollars to build a life filled with meaning and love. Colleen wondered which path she would end up choosing. Back in her mother's kitchen, she sat down and opened the journals again. She had been reading them from the very beginning, but this time she jumped ahead to the entries from the last year. "Colleen came over for dinner tonight. She looks so tired. There are new dark circles under her eyes that were not there 6 months ago. She keeps saying everything is okay. She is lying, but I do not know how to help her. I cannot tell her the truth without turning her entire life upside down." Another entry from 3 months later said, "Victoria called Colleen ungrateful in front of the whole family. I heard the story from Mrs. Patterson, who heard it from a friend at the country club. My daughter just stood there and took it. She even apologized for causing trouble. My brilliant, beautiful daughter said she was sorry for simply existing. I have failed her. I wanted to protect her from the burden of money, but instead, I left her with people who treat her like she is worthless." A final entry from just 2 weeks before her death read, "I have made a decision. Tomorrow I am telling Colleen everything. I will show her the legal documents, explain our family's past, and give her the power to choose her own future. She does not need the money, but she needs to know she has other options. She needs to see that there is a secret door in the wall of her prison, even if she decides never to use it, tomorrow. Her mother had planned to tell her everything the very next day, but that tomorrow never arrived. Colleen closed the laptop and sat in the quiet, dimming room. The kitchen clock ticked loudly. The refrigerator hummed softly. Somewhere down the street, a dog began to bark. Her mother had seen everything. She knew about Victoria's cruelty and Preston's indifference. She understood that Colleen's spirit was slowly being crushed. She had watched, and she had worried, and she finally decided to act. But she ran out of time. A fresh wave of grief washed over Colleen. But this time, it was not for her mother. It was for herself. It was for the woman she could have become if she had learned the truth sooner. It was for all the different choices she could have made. She thought back to her wedding day, and the way Preston had looked at her. She remembered believing that their love would last a lifetime. She remembered the first time Victoria criticized her cooking. She had told herself that things would get better with time. She remembered the first time Preston dismissed her opinion in front of their friends. She had found a way to excuse his behavior. All of that time, she had blamed herself. She had just tried harder to be better. 6 years of trying to be better. 6 years of making herself smaller and smaller. 6 years of wishing that love could fix people who had no desire to change. And her mother had known all of it. She had watched it unfold and had to carry that painful secret all by herself. Colleen placed a hand on her stomach. The baby kicked, a quick and powerful jab. "I will not let that happen to you," she whispered to the empty room. "I promise you that, no matter what I have to do." The words felt like a sacred vow. They felt like the start of something completely new. She spent one more night in her mother's house. Preston called her twice. She ignored both calls, letting them go straight to voicemail. His messages were dripping with irritation. Where was she? What was she possibly doing? His mother needed to finalize the menu for the baby shower. Decisions had to be made about the nursery. He told her she was being irresponsible. Irresponsible. Colleen laughed out loud, and the sound cut through the silent house. She was the owner of $100 billion. She was sleeping in her deceased mother's bed because it was the only place on earth she felt safe. She was married to a man who treated her less like a wife and more like an assistant, and he had the audacity to call her irresponsible. The whole situation was so ridiculous that it felt like a warm blanket. It felt like she had been given permission to be angry. It felt like the beginning of a deep, simmering rage. The next morning, Colleen drove back to the Blackwood estate, and she saw it all with new eyes. Everything looked different now. The long, sweeping driveway, the perfectly green lawns, and the massive stone walls had once seemed so grand, but now she saw the tiny cracks in the foundation. She saw the paint peeling around the edges of the windows. She saw a slight sag in the front porch that no one had ever bothered to repair. The Blackwoods were not as rich as they wanted everyone to believe. She remembered what Walter had told her. Their family was sinking in debt, staying afloat only because of their famous name and some clever loans. She remembered what her mother had written in a journal, marrying for a potential lifeline. Preston met her in the massive front hall. His expression shifted from relief to annoyance, and then to something that almost looked like worry. "You did not answer my calls," he said. "I was grieving," she answered. "Your mother passed away more than a week ago. At some point, you need to get on with your life." Colleen just looked at him. She truly saw the man she was married to, the man who was the father of her child. He was still very handsome, that was undeniable. But in that moment, she noticed the cruelty around his mouth. She saw the scheming in his eyes. He looked at her like she was a puzzle to be solved, not a person to be cherished. She said in a low voice, "You are right. Life does continue." She walked straight past him and went into the kitchen. He came after her. "Mother wants to discuss baby names," he said. "She thinks Margaret is too old-fashioned. She has a few other ideas." Colleen poured a glass of water for herself, and her hands were completely steady. "I want to name her after my mother." Preston made a sound of disgust. "That is not a choice you get to make on your own?" "I beg your pardon?" she asked. "This is our baby, a Blackwood baby. The name is incredibly important." Margaret was a Blackwood, Colleen reminded him. She was your great aunt. Preston's jaw became very tight. That is not the same. How is it not the same? He did not have a response. Colleen watched him struggle to find one. She saw the fury flash in his eyes when he failed. Let us just table this conversation for now, he finally said. Table it. That was his go-to phrase. It was his escape from any talk he did not want to have. In 6 years, she had never once won a single argument that was tabled. They would all vanish into a pile of problems that were never, ever fixed. No. The word landed between them like a heavy rock. What did you just say? He asked. No, I do not want to table it. I want to name my daughter Margaret. The name is in honor of my mother, who just passed away. Preston's face changed. She had caught him off guard. In 6 years of marriage, she had never once refused him so directly. Colleen, please be sensible. I am being sensible. I am being perfectly sensible. My mother is gone, and I want a way to remember her. What is not sensible about that? Before he could reply, Victoria entered the kitchen. She was dressed in cream-colored silk pajamas and a necklace of pearls. She appeared perfect, sophisticated, and threatening. I heard raised voices. Is everything acceptable in here? Preston said. Colleen is just getting sentimental about the baby's name. Victoria's gaze shifted from her son to Colleen. Her smile was patient, but had a very cold quality. Of course she is. Grief can make people behave in unusual ways. She walked toward the coffee machine. But we cannot let our emotions prevent us from making a smart decision. This child will have the Blackwood name for her whole life. She should have a name that is classy and respected. Like Victoria? Colleen asked. The older woman turned around. If you wish, I would be very honored. I would not. The words simply hung in the quiet room. A transformation began deep within Colleen. It was like a rusty old door groaning open or a stone barrier starting to fall apart. I am naming my daughter Margaret, she said, her voice completely firm. She is named for my mother. My mother lived her life with kindness, generosity, and goodness. She made beautiful things with her own hands, she supported her neighbors, and she loved others without expecting anything back. I cannot imagine a finer person to honor. Victoria's smile did not change, but her eyes became as cold as ice. You are being extremely dramatic, my dear. I am being clear. There is a distinction. Colleen left the kitchen before either of them could speak again. Her heart was beating hard in her chest. Her hands were trembling. But for the very first time in many years, she experienced something brand new. She felt totally and completely alive. That evening, she slept by herself in the guest bedroom. She continued to read her mother's journals. The early pages were filled with hope and joy. They shared stories of Colleen's first words, her first wobbly steps, and her very first day at school. They documented small achievements and sweet, uncomplicated moments. But as the years went on, a profound sadness started to appear in the writing. A concern about the Blackwoods became stronger with each new page. Colleen mentioned today that Victoria advised she lose a few pounds before the wedding. My daughter, who is healthy and lovely and perfect, now looks at herself in the mirror with a critical gaze. This is how it begins. This is how they diminish us little by little, one small piece of advice at a time, until we no longer remember who we once were. Colleen shut the laptop. She went to the mirror in the corner of the room and stared at her own reflection. She was 8 months pregnant, exhausted, and her face was swollen from water retention and from too much crying. Her hair was a total mess. Her skin was very pale, but her eyes were her mother's eyes. Her hands were her mother's hands, and her stubborn nature, which the Blackwoods always labeled as being difficult, was her mother's own stubbornness. She was not inferior to them. She had never been inferior to them. She had simply forgotten her own worth. The following days felt very strange. Colleen drifted through the Blackwood mansion like a phantom. She was there in body, but her thoughts were far away. She sat through the meetings to organize the baby shower. She agreed with all of Victoria's lavish plans. She allowed her husband, Preston, to think that everything had returned to how it was between them. But on the inside, a quiet rebellion was brewing. She was reading, strategizing, and getting ready for her next step. Walter, who had been her mother's lawyer, helped her finally grasp the actual scale of what she had inherited. She was the owner of a company, numerous properties, and charitable organizations that her mother had established in absolute secrecy. Billions of dollars were supporting education, medicine, and environmental causes. It was a legacy of silent generosity, concealed behind the life of an ordinary seamstress. Walter explained, "Your mother wanted to demonstrate that great fortune did not have to ruin a person. She wanted to prove that money could be used for good without anyone ever finding out. She never desired any credit or acknowledgement or compliments." And she had done it. "And now," he said softly, "you have to choose what kind of legacy you wish to create." Colleen thought about this all the time. She considered it in the shower while she had her breakfast, and throughout the miserably long family dinners. At those meals, Victoria would command everyone's attention, and Preston would support every single thing his mother declared. What kind of legacy did she want for herself? 1 week before the baby shower, she discovered something that changed absolutely everything. She was tidying her mother's home office, going through piles of old documents. She found a folder with a plain label that said, "Blackwood Investigation." Inside were papers, financial statements, and thorough reports from a private detective. They presented a shocking and full account of the Blackwood family's true financial state. The mansion had 3 separate mortgages. Preston's investment firm had been losing huge sums of money for a decade. The country club memberships, the expensive cars, the extravagant parties, it was all funded with loans and credit cards. They were only acting like they were rich. They were penniless. They had been penniless for years, and her mother had known every single detail. The investigation went even further. Before the wedding, her mother, Maggie, had kept a record of every question the Blackwoods had asked about her family. They had interviewed people in town. They had performed background checks on Colleen. They had carefully looked into whether the Hayes family had any secret money. The Blackwoods had suspected that there was a fortune. They had been counting on it. They had orchestrated the marriage between Preston and the quiet school teacher on the off chance it was true. The very last paper was a letter. It was from Preston Blackwood Sr. to a business associate. The letter asked for details about a company called Hayes Technologies and its founder. It was dated 3 months before Preston had asked her to marry him. "The Hayes woman my son is pursuing might have ties to the tech industry that are worth looking into before we move forward." Pursuing, as if she were some kind of animal to be captured. Colleen sat in her mother's silent office as the sun began to set. The reality of it all settled deep within her. They had never loved her. She had been inspected, evaluated, and targeted. Her entire marriage was a business arrangement, and she was the only one who had been left in the dark. The anger that had been simmering for weeks finally burst into a powerful flame. It was not a hot and chaotic fire. It was a cold, sharp fire, as hard and as clear as a diamond. She remembered every instance when Preston had brushed off her opinions. She remembered every instance when Victoria had made her feel small. She remembered every single time she had said sorry just for being in their world. They had married her for her money. It was all money that she never knew existed. It was money they could never get to because her mother was too smart, too cautious, and too protective. And now her mother was gone, and Colleen had options she never dreamed she had. She called Walter that evening. "I need to understand one thing," she said. "In the inheritance papers, are there any conditions related to my marriage?" Walter was silent on the other end of the phone for a long time. "Your mother added a new condition 3 years ago. Her private notes say it was right after a very unpleasant Christmas." "What is the condition?" Colleen asked, her heart pounding. "You cannot receive the full inheritance as long as you are married to someone who treats you as less than you are." Colleen let out a short, sharp laugh. Her mother had built her an escape route. She had given her a choice. "The condition does not require you to get a divorce," Walter explained very carefully. "It simply requires you to be honest with yourself. If you truly feel that Preston treats you well and you want to remain in the marriage, the inheritance is yours. The decision is entirely up to you." The choice was hers. For the first time in 6 long years, something was completely and totally hers to decide. The baby shower was in 3 days. Colleen began to get ready. She felt like a puppet on a string, performing for an audience of one. She offered a smile when a smile was expected. She nodded in agreement when it was required. She spoke words that carried no weight at all. But behind the empty performance, her mind was racing. It was charting a course, making new plans, and getting ready for what was next. Her meeting with Garrett Sullivan was on a Tuesday morning. This was the man now leading her mother's company. Garrett was the new chief executive officer of Hayes Technologies, and he had a trustworthy face with a solid, confident handshake. He brought to mind an old high school principal of Colleen's, a man who was serious but always treated everyone fairly. "Your mother had the most brilliant mind I have ever encountered," Garrett told her. They sat in his massive office, where a giant window framed the entire Boston skyline. She could have been famous, a celebrated genius everyone knew, but she chose to work from the shadows. She always said that the power people can see is the power they will try to take. Colleen felt a wave of confusion. What did she mean by that? She was convinced that as soon as people know you have influence, they start making plans to take it from you, or they try to manipulate you to get what they want. Garrett gazed out at the sprawling city below. She guided everything from behind the scenes. Her insights were always flawless. She was the silent guardian of this company and every person in it, and none of them ever knew she was the one protecting them. Colleen looked down at the world far below. Thousands of people moved through their day, completely unaware of the forces shaping their lives. "How many people are employed by the company?" she asked. 47,000, stationed all across the globe, and that number does not even include our many contractors and partners. The system your mother built touches the lives of millions. The incredible scale of it all felt like a heavy weight settling on her shoulders. $100 billion, 47,000 employees who depended on her, millions of people whose lives were in her hands. And all of this was happening while she was 8 months pregnant, trapped in a failing marriage with absolutely no idea what to do with her own future. "I cannot do this," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "Your mother said those exact same words when she first stepped into this role," Garrett said kindly. "And so did her father before her. No one is ever truly prepared for a responsibility of this magnitude." He offered her a comforting smile. "That is why we do not do it alone. We have entire teams of experts who have dedicated their careers to making sure this burden does not crush the person who has to bear it." He leaned in a little closer. "Your mother chose to carry that weight all by herself. That was her decision. You do not have to make the same one." The very evening, Colleen had her weekly appointment with Dr. Crane. He was her obstetrician, a gentleman in his late 50s with salt and pepper hair and kind, watchful eyes. "So, tell me how you're feeling today," he asked, wrapping the pressure cuff around her arm. "I am exhausted and completely overwhelmed. My mother just passed away." "I read about that. I am so very sorry for your loss," he said, making a quick note in her chart. "Are there any physical symptoms I should know about? Any headaches, swelling, or contractions?" "Just the usual pregnancy discomforts," she replied. "Nothing out of the ordinary." He nodded, but then he paused. His gaze lingered on her upper arm. Colleen glanced down and saw the faint, discolored mark on her fair skin. The bruise was from last week. Preston had squeezed her arm too tightly when she said she wanted to stay at her mother's house for a couple of nights. "How did that bruise get there?" the doctor asked, his tone perfectly even. "Oh, it is nothing. I was clumsy and ran into a door." Dr. Crane remained silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Colleen, I have been your physician for 7 months. He looked her right in the eye. "You have never struck me as a person who is clumsy enough to just walk into doors." She did not answer. She could not. The truth was caught in her throat, making it impossible to form words. "Help is available," he said in a soft voice, "if you ever feel that you need it. There are professionals who are experts at helping women in difficult circumstances. They provide total support without any judgment or questions. I do not need any help. Everyone needs help at some point." She left his office with a small, plain white card tucked into her purse. It had a phone number for a support line, a website address, and the name of a counselor. Of course, she would never make that call. Preston did not really hurt her. He would just grip her arm sometimes a little too hard. Or he would stand in the doorway to block her path if she tried to leave while they were arguing. It was not what anyone would call actual abuse, not the kind that left physical evidence you could not explain away. But she knew she was making excuses for him. A quiet voice inside her head was telling her so. It sounded just like the words she had read in her mother's private journals. It was the same voice of every woman who had stayed too long, telling herself that things were not really that bad, and hoping that one day everything would magically get better. But there is a huge difference between knowing the truth and having the courage to act on it. The confrontation she knew was inevitable came much sooner than she had anticipated. It happened during a formal dinner at the Blackwood family home. The entire family was gathered around a long, gleaming mahogany table. They were being served roast beef and asparagus with an expensive wine that Colleen was not allowed to drink because of the baby. As always, her mother-in-law, Victoria, was commanding everyone's attention. She was talking about a charity fundraiser she was planning, going on and on about the importance of appearances and how the guest list needed to be absolutely perfect. And of course, we need to talk about what Colleen will be wearing, Victoria announced to the entire table. Last year's event was rather tarnished by her unfortunate choice of dress. We simply cannot have a repeat of that public embarrassment. Colleen slowly raised her head from her plate. What was wrong with my dress? It was not suitable, my dear. It was a simple black formal gown. It was purchased at a department store. A heavy silence fell over the entire table. Preston suddenly found the asparagus on his plate to be the most interesting thing in the world. His sister Sloane just smirked to herself as she took a slow sip of her wine. In that single instant, something deep inside of Colleen finally shattered. It was a clean, sharp break, like a wire pulled too tight for too long that finally snaps. I want to invite some of my mother's friends to the baby shower. Victoria blinked, caught off guard by the abrupt change of subject. We have already discussed this. No, you have already discussed this. You made a decision and I was expected to accept it. I never actually agreed to anything, Colleen said, setting her fork down next to her plate. My mother had friends who were my family. They helped raise me. I want them to be there to celebrate the birth of her first granddaughter. This is a Blackwood family affair. This is a celebration for my baby. It is my celebration, and I will be the one who decides on the guest list. Preston cleared his throat with a loud, warning sound. Honey, please do not start a scene. I am not starting a scene. I am stating what I want. There is a very big difference. Victoria's smile was as cold and sharp as ice. It appears you are forgetting your place in this family. Perhaps my place is not what you think it is. The words hung in the still air, sending a ripple of shock through the silent room. Preston shoved his chair back from the table and shot to his feet. Colleen, I think you need to go lie down. You are just being emotional because of the pregnancy. I am not emotional. I am thinking clearly. For the first time in 6 years, my mind is perfectly clear. She stood up as well, the legs of her chair making a loud scraping noise on the polished floor. I am going to spend the night at my mother's house. I will come back tomorrow morning. You are not going to just walk out in the middle of dinner. Watch me. She turned her back on him and walked out of the dining room. She strode across the large foyer and headed for the front door, a door that had never symbolized a warm welcome, only a means of escape. The drive to her mother's house felt like breaking free from a prison. With every mile she drove, she created more distance between herself and the family that had never really accepted her. They had always judged her and put up with her, but they had never once shown her love. As soon as she was safely inside her mother's home, she slid down against the kitchen wall and finally let herself cry. The sobs came from deep within, shaking her entire body with their force. The baby inside her began to kick, as if protesting the sudden burst of emotion. I am so sorry, Colleen whispered, resting a hand on her stomach. I am so sorry, my sweet baby. I did not see it. I did not understand the kind of world I was about to bring you into. She remained there for hours, long after her tears had run dry. Her back grew sore from the cold kitchen tiles. She did not move until the first sliver of morning light appeared in the window. Only then did she slowly pull herself up, make a cup of tea, and start to make a plan. The charity gala was Victoria's masterpiece. 300 guests mingled under sparkling crystal chandeliers. A string quartet played softly in a corner. The whole room was a performance of great wealth, perfect style, and the carefully built image of high society. Colleen stood by the entrance. She was 8 months pregnant. She wore a dark blue dress that Victoria had picked out for her. She felt like a total fraud, like a poor girl playing dress-up for a single night. Preston's hand rested on the small of her back. His touch felt less like support and more like he owned her. "Smile," he whispered into her ear. "Everyone is looking at you." She managed to force a smile. It felt fragile on her face, like thin glass that was about to crack. The evening went exactly as she had predicted. There was polite small talk, expensive cocktails, and quiet battles hidden behind friendly compliments. The women's eyes drifted over her dress, her jewelry, and her pregnant stomach. Men shook Preston's hand, congratulating him as if he had done this all on his own. A short time later, Victoria stepped onto the stage. "Thank you all for being here tonight to support the Blackwood Foundation and our work in education." The room erupted in applause as people lifted their champagne glasses. As many of you know, this cause is deeply personal to our family. We believe in helping those who are not as lucky and creating opportunities for people who face challenges. She paused for dramatic effect. Her eyes moved across the crowd and then locked directly onto Colleen. And that mission of giving, of course, applies to our own family as well. My mother-in-law, Victoria Blackwood, stood in front of a room full of wealthy people holding a glass of champagne. "When my son Preston got married," she started, her voice as smooth as silk, "he picked a woman from a very humble background, a school teacher, a sweet girl from a little town with no family money and no powerful friends." Have you ever had to smile while someone tears you down in public? That was my life. "We welcomed her into our family, naturally," Victoria went on, "because we feel that a person's character is more important than their situation." A soft sound of agreement spread through the room. They all saw her as a generous woman. I could feel all the blood drain from my face. Of course, the change has been hard for her. It is a big adjustment to learn a whole new way of living, but we have patiently stood by our dear daughter-in-law through every little error, every misstep, and every unfortunate clothing choice. A small wave of laughter moved through the guests. It was quiet, but it felt like every single one of them was laughing at me. "And now," Victoria said, raising her glass, "as we get ready for a new generation, we are reminded why our charity work is so important, why we give so much to the people who need our assistance." The applause was deafening. I just stood there with a smile plastered on my face, feeling like I was breaking into a million tiny pieces on the inside. The rest of her speech was just as terrible. By the time she was done, Victoria had presented me as her personal charity case, a living and breathing advertisement for the Blackwood family's generosity. Preston squeezed my hand, completely unaware of what just happened. "You see?" he whispered. "My mother really adores you." I had to get away. "Excuse me?" I murmured, and started walking toward the restroom. I crossed the giant ballroom with my head held high, that phony smile stuck to my face. The second I was safely inside the ladies' room, the tears began to stream down my face. Preston's sister, Sloane, was standing by the sink. "You look really pale," she commented, her normal, sharp voice missing. "Is the baby okay?" "I am fine," I lied. "No, you do not look fine." I splashed cold water on my hot cheeks, smearing my expensive makeup. It did not make a difference. Nothing made a difference except getting through the night. "Can I ask you a strange question?" Sloane's voice was softer now, almost kind. "What did you know about my brother before you married him?" I looked at my own face in the mirror. I saw a stranger wearing a designer gown, with black lines of mascara running down her face. "What do you mean? What did I know?" Sloane paused for a very long time. "Never mind," she said, finally turning away. "Just forget I brought it up." But I could not forget it. I stored her odd question in my mind, adding it to a growing list of things about my husband's family that did not make any sense. I survived the rest of the party like a machine, smiling and nodding when people congratulated me on the baby. Some even gave me their sympathy about my mother passing away recently, They all acted like they had a right to know every part of my life. Later that night, I drove to my mother's empty house and completely fell apart. I wound up on the kitchen floor. It was always the kitchen floor. It was like if I sat where she used to sit, I could feel she was still with me. How much can a person take before they finally snap? There I was, 8 months pregnant, and completely on my own. I was married to a man who saw me as just another pretty thing that he owned. From the outside, my life looked perfect, but on the inside, I could barely breathe. Who am I? I whispered into the quiet, empty house. Was I only the poor girl who got lucky and married a rich man? Was I a secret heiress that nobody knew about? Or was I just the pregnant wife whose own husband could hardly stand to look at her? The only noise came from the low hum of the big refrigerator and the steady tick-tock of the grandfather clock, marking every second of my life. A car drove by on the perfect street outside. I started thinking about my mom, Maggie. When she was only 18 years old, she left behind a world of unbelievable wealth to create her own life based on her own rules. Could I ever be that courageous? The idea was absolutely terrifying. For 6 years, I had been Colleen Blackwood. I had memorized all their rules and bent myself into a shape that would make them happy. But if I was not a Blackwood, who was I? I had no clue. And that was the scariest part of everything. Sleep was not going to happen. At 2 in the morning, my thoughts were racing and the baby was kicking, unable to settle down. I did the only thing I could think of, the one thing my mother always did when she was upset. I went to the kitchen to brew a cup of tea. It was chamomile, her favorite kind. I even used her favorite mug, a plain blue one with a small chip on the edge. As the kettle began to whistle, I whispered to the steam, "I do not know what to do, Mom. I have no idea how to fix this." The kitchen was completely silent. I sat at her old wooden table with my tea, my fear, and my deep sadness. The street light from outside cast a pattern of light and dark squares on the floor. My mother must have sat in this very spot, looking at the same pattern, holding her own secrets. The baby kicked me again, a powerful and deliberate push. "I will figure this out," I promised my baby. "I'm not sure how, but I will find a way for us." The sharp buzz of my phone pulled me from sleep. I had fallen asleep on the couch again, and the sun was just beginning to rise. A single new message waited for me. It was from a number I did not know. The message read, "Your mother once helped me. I feel it is time to return that favor. Let us have lunch tomorrow. Eleanor Hayes." It was my grandmother. She was the woman I had never met. She was the woman my mother fled from 40 years ago. I stared at her name on the screen for what felt like a lifetime. At last, I typed back a simple response. "I will be there." The cafe was a small, charming place on a side street the Blackwoods would never bother to visit. Eleanor Hayes was already there, sitting in a booth near the window. I recognized her immediately. I had never seen a photo, but I saw my own face looking back at me. We had the same eyes. We had the same stubborn set to our jaws. Even our hands were the same, though time had drawn lines on hers. She was wearing simple navy slacks and a cream-colored shirt with a single strand of small pearls. "Colleen," she said, her voice shaking just a little, "you look so much like your mother." I could only manage a weak smile. "That is what people always tell me." "It is absolutely true," she said. "Please, come sit." I slid carefully into the seat across from her. The baby felt especially heavy, a constant pressure inside me. "I was not certain that you would come," Eleanor confessed. "I was not certain either," I admitted with honesty. We were quiet for a moment. We were two strangers connected by blood and by the woman we both had lost. "I was a terrible mother to Margaret," Eleanor said at last, her voice thick with regret. "I cared more about our family name and our wealth than I did about her own happiness. I always demanded that she be perfect, but I should have just loved her for herself." Tears began to fill her eyes. "I lost my daughter for 40 years because I was so consumed by my own pride." I looked down at my own hands, which were resting on my very pregnant belly. "She never mentioned you." "I would not expect her to," Eleanor replied, her voice strained. "I wounded her so deeply." She took a shaky breath. "I do not have any right to ask you for anything. I am not here to give you excuses. I had to meet you. I needed to say that I am sorry and I want to offer my help if you will have it. I looked closely at my grandmother's face. I searched for any sign of a lie, for the cold, controlling woman my mother wrote about in her journals. All I could see was a deep, honest, and tired sadness. My mother left me everything she had, I told her quietly. I know, she answered. I helped her arrange it all, the trust fund. Everything was done through our lawyers, of course. She never would have accepted my help in person. A small, sad smile touched Eleanor's lips. For 40 years, we communicated only through our attorneys. It was not much of a relationship, but it was all we had left. So you knew? About the money she saved? About the life she made for herself? I knew she was using her inheritance to create something good, Eleanor said. I knew she was trying to shield you from the kind of poison that can come with a great fortune. I respected her for that, even if I did not understand her reasons back then. The waiter arrived and we ordered coffee. The moment he walked away, Eleanor looked directly into my eyes. Your mother always said that money should be a tool, not your entire identity, she told me. She watched her parents, and she watched me, make the mistake of letting our wealth define our lives. She wanted something better for you. Eleanor's gaze was sharp and focused. So I will ask you, did she succeed? I have heard stories about your husband, Colleen, and about his family. My defenses went up immediately. What kind of stories? That they do not treat you with kindness, that you have lost your own self trying to fit in with them, that you are now living the very life your mother ran away from. Her words landed like heavy stones because they were the complete truth. I had to turn and look out the window because I could not bear to look at her. I am not here to pass judgment on you, Eleanor said in a soft voice. I am here because I failed my own daughter. I refuse to fail my granddaughter. Whatever you need, Colleen, whatever it will take to help you become free, I will provide it. I do not even know where to begin, I confessed. My voice so quiet it was almost gone. Then let me ask you this, Eleanor said. She leaned forward and a new fire burned in her eyes. What do you want, Colleen? Not what everyone expects from you. Not what is the safest choice. Not what will avoid a fight. What do you, in your heart, truly want? The question hit me with the force of a physical impact. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. What did I want? For 6 years, my only wish was for Preston to love me. I wanted the Blackwoods to finally see me as one of them. I wanted to create a family in a huge house that never, not for one day, felt like a home. But now, all of those wants felt hollow and false. They felt like they belonged to someone else. I do not know, I finally said, my voice a whisper. I have spent so much time trying to become a part of their world that I have forgotten what my own world even looks like. Eleanor nodded with a knowing look. Your mother felt that same way when she was your age. She did not know who she was supposed to be apart from our family's demands. Running away was the only way she could discover herself. I cannot run, I said, placing a hand on my pregnant stomach. I am 8 months pregnant. You cannot physically run, that is true, Eleanor said. But you can stop moving toward the things that cause you pain, and you can start walking toward the things that might bring you peace. I considered that idea, the big difference between running from something and making a clear choice. I thought about the secret door my mother had been trying to show me all this time. Your mother included a special requirement in your inheritance, Eleanor said. Did your lawyer, Walter, explain it to you? Yes, I answered. He told me. Then you understand that you have a choice, a genuine one. This is not a choice that is forced on you by your situation. This is a choice that is entirely and completely yours to make. Eleanor pushed a file folder across the table to me. I opened it. Inside were the legal papers. They were the official terms of what my mother had left me. I read one sentence over and over. My daughter must leave any relationship that makes her feel small. She cannot receive her full inheritance while she is married to someone who treats her as less than she is. I read the sentence 3 times. I let the meaning sink deep into my heart. My mother had built me an escape route. She had written her permission for me to leave directly into a legal document. She had given me the one thing I needed more than anything else. A reason, an excuse, A way out that was not about being a failure, but about saving my own life. She knew, I whispered. She always knew. That night, I returned to my mother's small house with a brand new feeling of purpose. I was not sure what my next step would be, but for the first time in many years, I felt like I had a clear path. I stayed up all night and read every single page of the inheritance papers. I began to understand the beautiful, protective plan my mother had created for me. The money was not just a simple gift, it was a tool, designed to give me options without forcing me to choose a certain one. What I did with those options was entirely up to me. For the first time since my mother passed away, I felt something besides grief and anxiety. I felt strong. My new life started with small, quiet steps. I was like a woman carefully picking up the pieces of herself that she had given away to other people. I opened my own bank account. It was the first account that was only in my name since before I got married. Preston had always insisted that we share everything. He said it was for simplicity and to prove that we were a team. Now I saw the real reason. It was about control. I transferred a small portion of money from my inheritance. It was not enough to make anyone ask questions, but it was enough to be a beginning. I started to write everything down. Every single cruel comment from my mother-in-law, Victoria. Every time Preston used our money to control me. Every time I asked for something little and was made to feel selfish. 6 years of painful memories filled a notebook that I kept hidden at my mother's house. Seeing it all written down in black and white made the pattern so clear. I could see how Preston had slowly pushed me away from my friends. I could see how Victoria had chipped away at my confidence. I could see how the entire family worked as a team to keep me quiet and powerless. One night, my best friend Rose came to my mother's house. She brought Chinese food and a bottle of sparkling apple cider. "You need to talk to me," she said, and her face was very serious. "And I want you to really talk to me, not the polite, empty conversation you have been giving me for years." So I did. For hours, the entire story just came pouring out of me. I told her about the inheritance, the secret condition in the will, and my slow, heartbreaking realization that my marriage was just a business transaction from the very start. Rose listened to every word. She did not interrupt me even once. When I finally ran out of things to say, she just sat there in the quiet of the kitchen for a long time. "I have been biting my tongue for 6 years, Colleen," she said at last. "I have been watching you shrink, watching you apologize for just being alive, watching you turn into someone I barely even knew anymore. Why did you not tell me something?" I asked, and my voice was barely a whisper. "Because you were not ready to listen," she replied. "Because every time I tried, you defended them. You made up excuses for them. You said it was not so bad." Rose's eyes were filled with a powerful love. "But you are ready now. I can see it in your eyes." "I am so afraid," I whispered. "Good," she said. For 6 long years, they had treated her like an object they owned. They chipped away at her self-worth until she hardly recognized the person in the mirror. But they made one huge mistake. They completely underestimated her. If you have ever been made to feel small and need a reminder of your own power, then hit that subscribe button, because this story is for you. My friend Rose once told me that true courage is not the absence of fear. It is being absolutely terrified and still doing what is right. I was sitting in my mother's kitchen, the single place where I felt safe. It was the place where I was slowly beginning to remember who I was before all this. I asked Rose, "What happens if I fail?" She leaned forward and took my hand. "But my dear, what if you fly?" Rose then said, "Now you have the opportunity to build something wonderful. Imagine your daughter watching her mother be brave instead of watching her mother surrender." My hand automatically went to my stomach. The baby kicked. A strong, firm push. "I want her to be proud of me," I whispered. My lawyer, Ross, was there with us. "You have to fight back," he urged. "All the tools you need are right here. Use them." Our first move was to look into the Blackwood family's finances. What my new legal team discovered was so much worse than I could have guessed. Preston Blackwood's company has been trying to get its hands on your mother's business for a long time, my lawyer Garrett told me. They are desperate for the cash to cover some huge debts. I had to know how much they were in the red. "We are talking tens of millions," he said. The family estate has been mortgaged 3 different times. Their investment firm is bleeding money every single day. Their whole fancy lifestyle is just a performance paid for with credit cards and the power of their name. I pictured the glamorous parties, the endless champagne, and all the expensive gifts. It was all a complete fabrication. The entire thing was built on a foundation of lies. Your mother refused their requests for money every single time, Garrett went on. He showed me the whole timeline. My mother saw the Blackwoods for exactly who they were and what they wanted. They set up your marriage as a last resort to get to her fortune, he concluded. That is what I believe happened. They assumed your family had money stashed away. They were making a bet that if they were patient, they would eventually get their payday. The anger that had been simmering inside me for so long turned into a cold, hard sense of purpose. They had stolen 6 years of my life. They had tricked me into a marriage, treating me like a simple key to a safe. And they had lost. My mother had been smarter than them, more protective, and far more careful. But this time, I was the one holding all the winning cards, and the Blackwoods had absolutely no idea. I glanced down at my wedding band, at the enormous diamond Preston had made such a show of giving me. I could still remember how beautiful I thought it was, feeling like the most fortunate woman alive. But now I recognized it for what it was: a claim, a brand, a mark of ownership that was cleverly disguised as love. What would become of my mother's company if the Blackwoods ever got the money? I asked Garrett. Honestly, he replied, they would dismantle it and sell it for scrap. They would close the successful parts, fire thousands of employees, and destroy everything your mother built just to pay off what they owe. My voice was steady when I spoke again. That will not happen. No, Garrett agreed quietly. It will not. I began packing my things that very evening. I was calm, without a single tear. I only took the items that were truly mine. I packed the books Preston always said were clutter, the cherished photographs of my mother and the baby blanket I had just finished knitting from one of her old projects. Ross assisted me in moving my belongings to my mother's house. He made several quiet trips with his car so that no one would notice anything unusual. You are not escaping, Ross said to me as we loaded the final box. You are walking toward the person you were always meant to be. I nodded, understanding he was right. The difference was everything. I was not running away in shame or admitting defeat. I was making a conscious and powerful decision for my own future. 3 days before my daughter was due to be born, everything was finally set. The bank accounts were now separate. All the legal documents were prepared, and my friends were ready to support me. The only thing left was to say my goodbyes. Preston discovered me in the grand entryway of the Blackwood mansion, with my one suitcase waiting by the front door. His look changed from confused to angry, and then I saw an emotion on his face I had never witnessed before: genuine fear. "What is all this?" he asked sharply. "I am leaving you, Preston." "You cannot just leave," he said with a scoff. "You are about to have my baby any day." "Our baby," I corrected him gently. "And yes, I can leave. In fact, I am choosing to leave." He took a step toward me, but I took a deliberate step back. The space between us felt heavy with 6 years of words that were never spoken. "Is this because of the baby shower?" he asked, trying to sound calm. "Is it about what my mother said at the gathering? We can sort this out. I will have a talk with her." "This has nothing to do with the baby shower or the party or any single moment," I said, my voice completely steady. "This is about 6 years of you treating me like I was not even a person." "That is completely absurd," he snapped. "We have given you the world." "You have given me nothing at all," I shot back. "You have taken my confidence, my happiness, and my faith in myself. You chipped away at me piece by piece, day after day, until I forgot what it felt like to be whole." Preston's charming facade finally cracked, showing the ugly truth that was always there. "You are being overly emotional. You are being hysterical. It is just the pregnancy hormones." "No," I replied. "This is me speaking with clarity for the first time in 6 years." At that very second, the front door opened wide. Victoria and Preston Jr. were returning from a lunch at their country club. They froze in place when they saw the scene. "What is happening here?" Victoria asked with authority. "Colleen is having some sort of emotional episode," Preston said, attempting to regain control. She has this wild idea that she is leaving. I do not think I am leaving, I said softly. I know I am. Victoria's gaze darted from my face to my suitcase. Then her eyes locked back on mine, on my steady hands, and the peaceful expression I wore. I saw a flicker of understanding in her eyes. You should think about what you are giving up, Victoria said, her voice becoming icy. The financial security, the family name, the kind of life your child should have. What will everyone say? I no longer care what other people think, I told her. I only care what my daughter will think when she is old enough to know what kind of life I created for her. Sloane, my sister-in-law, appeared at the top of the landing. She must have been drawn by the raised voices. Victoria's face wore a strange, hopeful expression. She changed her tone, making her voice syrupy sweet and full of fake concern. Colleen, my dear, I realize I can be a challenge, but every single thing I did was for your own good, to make you better, to make you worthy of the Blackwood name. Worthy? A sharp, bitter laugh escaped my lips. That is the entire issue, Victoria. I was always worthy. I was always more than enough. You just had to convince me I was not, so you could pull my strings. Preston suddenly lunged at me, his fingers digging into my arm with painful force. You are not leaving this house with my child, he snarled, his grip like a steel trap. Have you ever been so betrayed it felt like your entire world collapsed? If you have, you will want to see how this woman flipped the script on a family of manipulators. Colleen looked down at his hand, crushing her skin. Then she locked her eyes with his. Let go of me. His grip only tightened. I already told you. You are not going anywhere. And I already told you to let me go, she answered back. Her voice was calm and icy. It carried a note of finality that made him pause. Something in her gaze made him drop her arm and take an involuntary step back. At that moment, Sloane's voice sliced through the tension from the top of the stairs. Why do not you just tell her the truth, Dad? Tell her the real reason you chose to marry her. Sloane, you will be quiet, Victoria hissed at her. Do not say another word. No, Sloane replied, walking down the staircase. I am through with staying silent. I am finished pretending that this family is something that it is not. She paused on the middle of the staircase. Colleen deserves to know the truth. The blood drained from Preston's face, leaving him pale. Sloane, please do not do this. Tell her, Sloane insisted. Tell her about the entire plan, the plot for this marriage. Tell her that you tracked her down because you were convinced her family had some kind of secret fortune. Colleen turned around very slowly, her eyes fixed on her husband. Her voice was as hard as stone. Tell me. So, he told her. He told her every last detail. At the beginning, his words stumbled out, full of hesitation, but then they came pouring out in an angry flood, as if she were the one to blame for discovering his deception. He explained the whole scheme, from the investigation into her background to their greedy assumption that her mother had a hidden fortune. He confessed that their entire relationship had been one long, desperate gamble. They thought if they were just kind enough, just patient enough, the money would eventually be theirs. For 6 years, Colleen had wasted 6 years of her life on them, and every second of it was based on an ugly lie. When Preston finally stopped talking, Colleen calmly reached for her suitcase. Her hands did not shake. Her voice was perfectly steady. Now I have something to tell you. This is something my mother never had the chance to say. Her gaze passed over each of them. She saw Victoria, whose perfect makeup could not hide her ruined life. She saw Preston Jr. with his failing business and his borrowed reputation. She saw Preston with his handsome features and his completely hollow heart. Then her eyes rested on Sloane, the one person who finally told the truth, even if it was far too late to matter. My inheritance is for $100 billion, and not a single one of you will ever get a penny of it. After saying that, she turned around and walked straight out the door. The drive to her mother's home took only 23 minutes. She did not cry a single tear. She did not yell in rage. All she felt was a peculiar, empty lightness. It was like a massive weight had finally been lifted off of her. It felt as if a prison door had finally swung wide open. 3 days after that, she filed for divorce. And that very same day, she went into labor. The hospital room was bright and sterile. filled with the soft sounds of medical equipment. Colleen held onto the bed rails, taking a deep breath as another contraction came. Ross was right there next to her, holding her hand firmly. "You are doing amazing, Colleen. Just a little more." Dr. Crane's voice was a comforting presence. "You are so close. We just need one more strong push." Colleen pushed with all the strength she had left. Her whole body shook with the effort, the pain, and the sheer power of bringing a new life into the world. And then she heard it. The cry of a baby. It was strong and loud and full of energy, and it was the most wonderful sound she had ever heard. "You have a daughter," Dr. Crane said, "and she is absolutely perfect." A nurse carefully placed the tiny baby on Colleen's chest. She was so small, red, and wailing, with a wrinkled face and little fists balled up tight. Her cries were powerful, making sure everyone heard her. "Hello, Margaret," Colleen whispered. "I have been waiting for you for so long." The baby immediately stopped crying. Her dark, newborn eyes looked around as if they were searching for something. They landed on her mother's face, and she grew calm. "My name is Colleen," she said gently. "I am your mom, and I am making you a promise right now. I will never allow anyone to make you feel like you do not matter. I will never allow anyone to say you are not good enough. You are my entire world. You are everything to me." The tears finally began to flow. They were not tears of grief or worry. They were tears of just being in that one perfect moment. This was her daughter. This was her purpose. The next few days were a blur of feeding, changing, and very little sleep. Colleen moved into her mother's house for good. She filled the space with baby items and fresh flowers, building a home filled with genuine warmth. Ross came by every single day, always with food and constant encouragement. Her great-grandmother Eleanor visited for the very first time. She held the baby with trembling hands as tears of happiness ran down her old cheeks. "She is the spitting image of Margaret," she whispered. Walter, the family's lawyer, visited with documents to be signed and offered some comforting advice. "Take all the time you need to heal," he said with a kind smile. "The business is stable and the money is safe. Just put all your focus on your little girl." Dr. Crane even came to the house to check on them. "You are both recovering wonderfully," he told her with a warm look. "You are doing a fantastic job." Even Garrett Sullivan sent a huge arrangement of flowers. The note with it was simple. It said, "Welcome to the world, Margaret. Your grandmother would be so incredibly proud." 1 month later, she held a press conference. Colleen was seated at a large table inside a conference room at Hayes Technologies. She looked out at a sea of reporters and the flash of cameras. "My name is Colleen Hayes," she started. "I am using my mother's family name to honor her. Margaret Hayes chose to lead a quiet life, but she built something truly amazing. She founded a company that gives jobs to almost 50,000 people around the globe. She also started a foundation that supports education, healthcare, and environmental protection. It is a legacy of compassion that has touched millions of lives." Colleen paused for a moment, taking a breath before her next important words. "I am here today to let you all know that I will be taking over to lead that legacy into the future. I'm not doing this because I have to, but because I want to. My mother often said that money is just a tool. It does not define who you are. I believe that as well." The reporters fired questions at her about her mother, the company, and her plans. She answered each question with confidence and truth. She never mentioned the Blackwood family, not even once. She did not need to. What came next was no surprise to anyone. Preston's attempts to fight the divorce fell apart after his family's serious money problems became public knowledge. Their family estate was sold, their investment firm went bankrupt. And the Blackwood name, the thing they valued above all else, was suddenly worthless. In a surprising turn, Sloane got in touch with her. She was not looking for money or for forgiveness. She just seemed to want a way out of her situation. "I only married into that family because I felt like I had no other way," she told Colleen when they met for coffee. "But you taught me that there are other choices, that you can just leave it all behind. I am starting to think that I can do that too." It was not the beginning of a new friendship, not right away, but it was real. It was a bond that was formed from honesty, not from secrets and lies. One evening, Colleen sat in her mother's kitchen, which was now her kitchen. She held baby Margaret, who was sleeping soundly in her arms. The baby's face was so peaceful and perfect. She was everything Colleen had ever wanted, long before she even knew it. The back door opened with a soft creak and Ross walked in, just as she did most evenings. "Tomorrow is a big day. Are you ready for your first meeting with the board?" "Not even a little bit," Colleen answered with a soft laugh. "Good." "Being well prepared is never exciting," Ross joked, pouring 2 cups of tea and taking a seat. "So tell me how you're really doing." Colleen considered his question. Only 6 months before, she had been slowly fading away. She was in a marriage with a man who saw her as property, and she was stuck with people who made her feel completely worthless. But now she was a new mother, a business owner, and a woman who was finally creating a life that made her proud. "I'm absolutely terrified," she admitted. "But it is a positive kind of terror this time. It is not that old, helpless feeling. This is an exciting kind of fear. It feels like I am on the edge of a cliff, about to take an incredible leap of faith." Ross gave her a warm smile. "Your mother would be so incredibly proud of you." "I truly hope she would be," Colleen replied. "I am doing my best to be worthy of her, of the company she built, and of the decisions she made." Margaret stirred in her sleep, letting out a tiny sound before settling down again. Colleen looked at her daughter's precious face and suddenly understood something profound. Her mother had not kept the money from her as a punishment. She had kept it hidden to ensure Colleen would learn to rely on herself. She wanted her daughter to find her own inner strength, to know who she was before she had the resources to become anyone she wanted. It was the most precious inheritance her mother could have ever left her. Just then, her phone vibrated with a new text message from a number she did not know. "Hello?" A message popped up on her phone. "I am so sorry to bother you, but I saw your story on the news. My mother-in-law, well, it is a very long story, but seeing you gave me hope. It made me feel like maybe I am not as trapped as I thought." Colleen read the words again, feeling the hope behind them. Her own mother had built a legacy from nothing, simply by doing good in the world. Now it was Colleen's turn to continue that work. She typed her reply. "You are not trapped. You never were. You just have not found the exit yet. Keep looking for it. It is there, I promise." She hit send and set her phone down. She looked around the cozy kitchen, a room full of memories, secrets, and so much love. Her mother's apple pie recipe was still taped to the inside of the spice cabinet. It listed cinnamon, 2 teaspoons, nutmeg, 1/2 of a teaspoon. The very last ingredient simply said, "Love Unlimited." Colleen smiled. Across the hall, her daughter was sound asleep. Outside, the sunset painted the sky in the brilliant colors of a new day. She was not the same woman who stood heartbroken at her mother's funeral 8 months ago. She was no longer the quiet wife who apologized for existing, or the daughter who never really knew the woman who raised her. In her place stood someone new, a person forged by loss and courage and a deep refusal to be small. She was Colleen Hayes, a mother, a leader, a survivor, and her story was far from over. Her journey is a powerful reminder to anyone who has ever felt invisible or unimportant that you are never truly alone. Every story like this shines a light on the strength we all have inside. It brings up an important question. Have you ever had to walk away from someone or something that was making you feel small? If you feel comfortable sharing, I would be honored to read your story in the comments below. And if this story brought someone to mind who needs to hear this message of hope today, please consider sharing it with them. You never know when a single story can give a person the strength they need to make a life-changing decision. Thank you for being a part of this community and for listening. Your wonderful support is what makes this channel possible. As a final note, every story we tell is carefully researched, written, and edited by our team. We do this to bring you meaningful lessons. Every single word is chosen with purpose because you deserve content that inspires and has meaning.